In general, the average level of many workers in the circle was quite high. Many of them were quite conscious people. The desire for the formation of circles and for classes, for joint reading was a very common phenomenon among machine-building workers. Personally, I know examples where workers who stood apart from the revolutionaries joined together to issue newspapers and magazines. Most often, Russian Vedomosti was written out, from which ILO's correspondence about the German Social Democratic labor movement was read with special interest. Russian wealth was written out from thick magazines. I also know cases of subscription to Severny Vestnik. Of the books, Pavlenkov's publications were especially popular. The summer of 1894 passed rather calmly in the recruitment of workers for new circles, which naturally formed around more developed workers. For a better statement and development of this matter, Shelganov used a lot of effort. All available forces of our vast area were grouped around it. The very business of forming circles went this way. One of the most active workers looked closely at his comrades in the workshop. The matter is mainly about factory workers, tried to enter into close relations with the most attractive and most suitable workers in his opinion. He would hand a newspaper with an interesting article or some book, sometimes illegal, and in this way he tried the soil. In the summer, workers gathered somewhere in a meadow or in a grove, conducted general conversations, read. As far as I know, in the summer of 1894 there was no one left from the intelligentsia of the Social Democrats behind the Nevsky Zastava, and the workers taught themselves in their circles. The work was carried out by Shelganov, Babushkin, and their closest comrades. I, too, was not in Petersburg in the summer of 1894. I went abroad to Paris, partly with the goal of getting to know social life and the working class movement in the West, and partly with the goal of getting to know the history of our revolutionary movement. However, my trip was not entirely successful. Of the Social Democrats among Russian youth in Paris, I, except Gurevich, who was in connection with the Geneva group Emancipation of Labor, found almost no one. The old emigrants were somehow distrustful of the social democratic movement developing in Russia, and the social democracy is not entirely friendly. At the suggestion of my father, I visited P.L. Lavrov, whom, as I said, once knew my father, and through Lavrov I met Shishko, Folkovsky, and Lazarev, who asked me to tell them about our movement and for this how they gathered, inviting me to their place. The impression of the old Russian emigrants was not particularly favorable for me. It seemed to me that they froze on social aspirations and concepts of the 70s. I focused on studying the history of the Russian revolutionary movement, for which there was more than enough material in the Parisian Russian Library, and at the same time I became acquainted with the French labor movement, studying the relevant socialist literature and attending open meetings of various French socialist and workers' organizations, both Hedonists and Jorsists. But the acquaintance with the Russian emigrants ended for me dysfunctional. Among them, arrests were made at that time. Lazarev, who came to see me several times, was also arrested, which became known to the French police, who monitored Russian emigrants. As a result, when I returned to Russia at the border, I was searched in the most thorough manner. However, despite the most thorough search, I was still able to smuggle in the program of the French Labour Party in Marx's pamphlet 18 Premier Louis Bonaparte. Having returned to Petersburg, I, of course, hastened to go for the Neva outpost, where I soon saw a lot of new things. In the autumn of 1894, at the initiative of V.A. Shelganov, several intellectuals of the Social Democrats who were adjacent to the Marxist circle of V.A. Ulyanov were invited to study in working circles. He himself went for Nevskaya Zastava to work with workers, among whom he was known under the name of Lysy. At the time I tried to bring some of my closest academy comrades to the group classes with the workers. But I hardly found anyone suitable for this. From Adolf Nikitin was the only one who was involved in the classes with our workers at the time, and through my means, with the help of Babushkin, he received one of the workers' circles outside the Neva outpost. With workers, Comrade Junior Korstergun, it turned out to be not quite suitable for this work in its inactivity and soon completely moved away from it. Thus, by the winter of 1894, the most valuable ties with workers beyond the Nevskaya Zastava went to the group of 6 Ulyanov, with whose members the workers I knew were members of my original circle, Babushkin, Merkulov, and others. In the winter of 1894, work on the organization of workers' circles and the cultivation of individuals continued. But there was already a certain disappointment in her. Something is missing. But why? This began to be clarified little by little, and, it seems to me, two events helped clarify. These were riots at the Nevsky mechanical plant of the Moscow Partnership, formerly Semyanikov, behind the Nevskaya Zastava, and a strike at the port. The picture of the riots at the Nevsky mechanical plant is still vividly preserved in my memory. On Christmas Day, 1894, I went to my workmates for the Neva outpost, but was very late due to the pursuit of the detective, from whom it was necessary to no matter what gets off or back home. When I left the house where I lived in Saperny Lane and looked around as usual, I did not notice anything suspicious. But, as I walked past Vilitsky Lane, I noticed a lurking subject on the corner who aroused some doubt in me about me. And indeed, when I walked along Vilitsky Lane towards the Preobrazinsky Square, I noticed a figure of a man following me at a distance, swaying from side to side. How drunk! I thought it was a detective, and decided to check my assumption. Having reached the corner and crossing the intersection, I pretended to want to go in one direction. A figure followed me. I turned and went in the other direction. The one who followed me did the same. My suspicions were confirmed. Walking past the Preobrazinsky parade ground, which at that time was just starting to build up, I stopped for a minute, as if to light a cigarette. My pursuer also stopped. When I reached Sabarovsky Prospect, I again did the same maneuver, quickly turned a corner and went in one direction, and then turned and took the opposite. My pursuer, who ran after me so as not to lose sight of me, ran into me face to face. Noting that two horse-drawn tracks were coming from the Nikolaevsky station, I quickly went to Smolny. My pursuer hurried after me. I missed one carriage, slowing my pace. The detective caught up with me and evened with me. I still slowed down, and he was ahead of me. At this time, a second car passed by. I rushed and jumped to the platform step. The detective rushed after me, but I took such a menacing pose that he did not dare to jump in and stayed on the pavement, noting that there was another car behind him, to which he ran. I did not take my eyes off him at the very moment when he jumped into the carriage and climbed the Imperial, in order to be able to better follow the carriage on which I was driving, jumped off it and rushed into the gate of the nearest house. Hiding behind the gate, after a few moments I saw a car passing by, on the Imperial of which there was a detective chasing me, vigilantly watching the car from which I had just jumped off. After giving him a decent distance to travel and wishing for similar success in the future, I, having made sure that no one was following me anymore, moved to Znamenskaya Square, while my pursuer rolled towards Smolny. I did not go to the place of departure of the tram, but began to wait for it in the dark, under the arch of the house through which he passed. Jumping on the run into the last carriage and seeing that no one was following me, I quite calmly drove to the Nevskaya Zastava. On the Schlisselburg tract, I went near the house in which grandmother lived. I did not find him at home. He did not wait for me, since I was late. He escaped into a fire. Something was amiss on Semyanikov, his mistress told me. And indeed, going out again on Schlisselburgsky Prospect, I noticed an unusual animation. At the gates every now and then came across groups of workers who talked animatedly about something. These groups came across more and more as I approached the Semyanikovsky plant. 100 Cossacks swept past me with a noise and a boom, followed by another with a wagon for the wounded. Well, they'll pour it into the people of Semeniks, show where the legs grow. From an ironic exclamation came from the sidewalk. Finally, I'm at the factory. There were thousands of crowds. At the factory a fence and 2 rows dismounted Cossacks, with their guns, were on horseback. There were police detachments. I climbed onto the Imperial steam horse, 3 cars, stopped by the workers with the help of a barricade of Chekhovna sleds. From the Imperial I could well see the site. The factory office was torn apart, the windows and doors were knocked out, there was no fire in them, but the plant was still lit. Glasses have been increased in some places. The main building of the plant was cordoned off by hundreds of Cossacks, gendarmes, and police, and these, in turn, were surrounded by several thousand workers. At that time, about 3,000 worked at the Nevsky mechanical plant, but since it was happening at about 8 p.m., the factory workers who had just finished work joined the crowd. The whole story is played out because of what? There were already 2 to 3 cases that the workers were not given on time a 2-week wage. This order threatened to become commonplace. Christmas was coming. The payment deadline had already expired, and the factory administration was discouraged by a lack of money. There was no money even on the eve of the holiday, when they were especially needed by the workers. As a result, the defeat of the office, breaking glass in factory buildings, an attempt to set fire to the house of the manager on the one hand, pumping up workers from fire pipes, this is in winter, Cossacks, gendarmes, police. However, this is not all. For those who escaped into the city of fear for the sake of clerks, the police were sent. Caught and surrounded by Cossacks, information for cover, in 3 ways the clerks were immediately taken to the factory. Gendarme officers on the same night gave the workers long required pay. The riot ended in victory, and the victory did not go unnoticed. I must add that the group workers did not take an especially active part in the story, so even in our Russian system, look for the guilty among those who are in the presence of the police and factory bloodhounds was impossible. None of our workers was hurt in this case. But the excitement excited by the riot at the Semyanikovsky plant, however, did not pass without a trace. It was the occasion of almost the first attempt of the Social Democrats to exert influence on a wider circle of workers, about the necessity of which they had already begun to talk at that time. In haste, an agitation brochure was made in the form of a notebook outlining the position of workers at the Semyanikovsky plant. As far as I know, the author of this propaganda brochure was I.V. Babushkin. Read at a meeting of several workers, it was printed using a hektograph and distributed throughout the plant, although not particularly successfully. This new device of the Social Democrats, although still as a separate case, has attracted the attention of workers. Elderly workers began vividly recalling the similar activities of former revolutionaries, talking about brochures, leaflets, and riots that had happened earlier in this factory. Of course, most of the storytellers greatly exaggerated, but these stories greatly influenced the mood of youth and paved the way for a wider distribution of illegal literature. Attracted the attention of workers. Elderly workers began vividly recalling the similar activities of former revolutionaries, talking about brochures, leaflets, and riots that had happened earlier in this factory. Of course, most of the storytellers greatly exaggerated, but these stories greatly influenced the mood of youth and paved the way for a wider distribution of illegal literature. Attracted the attention of workers. Elderly workers began vividly recalling the similar activities of former revolutionaries, talking about brochures, leaflets, and riots that had happened earlier in this factory. Of course, most of the storytellers greatly exaggerated, but these stories greatly influenced the mood of youth and paved the way for a wider distribution of illegal literature. Another story, a strike in the port, took place at Shrovetide. In the port of the New Admiralty, as well as in its branch on the Galerny Island, the working day was from 7 a.m. to 6 p.m. and 1 o'clock for lunch. At the same time, 15 minutes of preferential ones were given. IV workers could come at 7:14 hours in the morning and at 1:14 hour after lunch. In January 1895, the port commander, the famous Verkhovsky, took the privilege away, so he had to come to work at 7 o'clock in the morning and at 1 o'clock. On Monday, January 6, new rules were announced. Come to work at 6:12 hours in the morning, and lunch time was reduced by another quarter hour. On Tuesday, part of the workers came to work in the old way. They were not allowed. The gates were locked, and they were forced to pay a fine, as they did not work part of the day. About 100 people were late. The workers asked the guards to let them in, but were refused. Then they broke the gate and entered the workshops. There, they turned to working comrades, inviting them to quit work, which was immediately done. The administration immediately called on a detachment of the city and near camp with an bailiff at the head. The usual followed, you rebel, and decent swearing on occasion. To the remark on the part of the workers that they did not want to swear, but to talk seriously about the matter, he paused a verse and began to address only individual workers. You are rebelling. What do you need? To this, everyone replied that he did not think of rebelling and he only needed to fulfill the conditions agreed upon by the administration when hiring, that he wanted to work, as before, and did not agree to increase the time. In addition, one worker, on behalf of his comrades, clarified the matter in detail and sensibly and expressed all the demands. The attempt to arrest him failed, thanks to resistance from the whole mass of workers. At 1 o'clock, a beep to work was given, but it had just the opposite effect. The same story the next day, but no police swearing was heard. The order among the workers was exemplary. It was obvious that someone skillfully led the movement. Workers who stood at the workshops before 1 o'clock and demanded concessions immediately went home, as soon as a beep to work was given. On Wednesday, the same story. On Thursday, The administration itself stopped work before the end of the week under the pretext of the onset of Shrovetide, and on Monday in the first week of fasting, workers went to work on old conditions. The victory was won, moreover, at the state-owned factory. Some of the factory administration got scolded for sympathizing with the workers and for interfering in their own business. Here are two, not without importance, events of the winter of 94 to 95. The third event was a strike at Voron and Spinning Mill. Among the workers of the circle, the time is coming for new trends. There was a fracture. The idea that a truly conscious worker should be closer to life around him, should more actively relate to the needs and requirements of the mass of workers and to everyday violations of all human rights is becoming stronger and stronger. That the conscious worker should participate in the surrounding life, and not shun it, as he has done so far. But how to participate? What to do? There was still no definite answer to this. In the spring of 1895, the shades of a new direction became thicker. A rather sharp protest is already heard against the previous way of doing business, a protest against indifference to particular cases of life of the surrounding mass of workers. The obvious dissatisfaction with the circle and self-development begins. There is a thirst for new, fruitful work. Obviously, a transition has begun to a new agitation period.